All right, good afternoon. Thank you for getting back from your lunch break. This next section, we're going to walk through the census operation and talk a little bit about more detail about the way we make sure we count everyone once and only once and in the right place, including people who are experiencing homelessness, including people who are in special housing situations, and we're going to talk about how we mail out questionnaires. And one thing before I get to it, I'm going to talk about our mailings, but just so you see, this is what mailing number one looks like if it's just an invitation to participate in the census. I'm going to talk about this in a lot more detail in a second. And if we actually include a questionnaire, it's basically just a little thicker envelope with a questionnaire inside. I will talk about these. I'll tell you what's inside of each mailing and what our whole mailing strategy is about. Now, responding to the census will be easier than it's ever been before. Everyone will be able to respond the way they prefer, either through the internet, over the phone, or by returning a paper questionnaire. I want to say I am focusing on the three ways to respond because I have appeared probably in front of 20 community organizations, cities, and groups in the last 6 months. And there's a misconception that because we're doing an electronic census, that's the only option people have. People start off saying, our people don't have access to the internet, and are they going to be disadvantaged by the fact that you're doing the census over the internet? There are three ways people will be able to respond to the internet, and I'll go into more details on this. But we're emphasizing the internet because it's quicker and easier for our respondents, and it's more efficient for us. However, we were clearly cognizant of the fact that not everyone has access to the internet. And many more who have access don't want to use the internet. So everyone who wants to will have an opportunity to send a paper questionnaire in just as they did in 2010. We're using data from the American Community Survey and from the FCC to identify areas with low internet connectivity. And additionally, we know that certain demographics, such as the elderly, are less likely to use the internet. So for those households, which amount to about 20% of the country, we're going to mail a questionnaire to them in our first mailing. And I'm going to give you some detail on our mailing process. But everyone who has not responded by our fourth mailing, shortly after Census Day, will also receive a paper questionnaire that they can fill out and send in. So people have that option, but always throughout this process, they could pick up the phone, call our Census Questionnaire Assistance Centers and say, I need help filling out the census, or I want to give you my census response right on the telephone. And those will be answered by one of our sworn staff who can take their census information right over the phone. Now, we're estimating right now that 60% of the people who self-respond will use the internet. About 33% will return a paper questionnaire, and 7% will respond over the telephone. These were our projections, and they match the results that we had in our Providence, Rhode Island test. So we had good confirmation on that type of responsiveness in Providence. Now, the internet gives us another advantage. For the first time, people will be able to respond without giving a census ID that we provided to them. We call this non-ID processing, but it might better be thought of as real-time ID processing. When someone types in an address over the internet, we will automatically match that address to the master address file, and then we'll take their response. If we can make an immediate match, we do the work to reconcile that address and all the information as a subsequent operation. This is huge for us. What it means is people can respond anywhere, anytime, using their smartphone, their tablet, their personal computer. It means that people who support the census, our census partners, will be able to encourage people to respond right when they're talking to them. In the past, people needed to find their paper questionnaire we mailed to them and then try to send that in. Now they can pick up their phone and respond the minute they're encouraged to do so. Imagine holding a respond to the census event in a sports stadium, in a conference, after services at church, synagogue, or mosque, at a school. People can respond right then and there. We've not been able to do this before, and we think it's a great opportunity to get people to respond to the census. I think it's useful for you to take a look at our mailing strategy. We'll be printing and mailing materials across the nation. To assist in this effort, our print vendor will print over 3 billion mailing pieces, including invitations, letters, postcards, and questionnaires. When it's time to respond, most households, 95% of all households, will receive an invitation to respond to the census in the mail. Every household will have the option of responding online, by mail, or by phone. You notice I keep repeating that because that's important, that's burned into people's minds, that those are the options. We're going to begin contacting households and inviting them to respond to the census on March 12th, 2020. The packet will contain an invitation to participate in the census, information about how to respond online or by phone, with the phone numbers for each of the 12 non-English languages that are spoken in our call centers. And it will include their unique census ID. Now, I talked about the fact that they can respond without the ID, but it's valuable if they have the ID to use the ID to respond. It speeds up the process of identification. As I mentioned in my previous slide, 20% of the country, which we call Internet Choice Panel, will receive a paper questionnaire in their first mailing. The rest of the country is encouraged to use the internet. Their initial package will not include the paper questionnaire. These are the panels we call Internet First. We'll be sending bilingual paper questionnaires in Spanish and English to areas with high proportions of Spanish speakers in both the Internet Choice and the Internet First panel. Now, what do we mean by high proportions? We choose to send a bilingual questionnaire to an entire census tract if at least 20% of the occupied housing units in that tract contain at least one adult who might require what we call Spanish assistance. That means someone 15 or older who speaks Spanish and does not speak English very well. So we are reaching out with the bilingual questionnaire in an expanded way to ensure that we provide that opportunity to people. We based that assessment on the data from our 2013-2017 American Community Survey, which pulls together that information of languages spoken within the household. Now, we're going to be working with the United States Postal Service to stagger the delivery of these invitations over several days. That way, we can spread out the number of users responding online. We'll be able to serve respondents better if they need help over the phone, and it helps with the mail and data collection and processing process to spread it over multiple days rather than one day where we try to send out everyone in the census their invitation. Most importantly, I mentioned it before, I'm going to mention it again. On the fourth mailing, every household that has not responded to the census will receive a paper questionnaire. We then send one final reminder postcard. It's not too late to remind people that it's not too late to respond. And on May 13th, we'll begin following up with in-field visits to those housing units that have not responded in any of our self-response overtures. I'm not going to spend time on our media campaign. I'm sure that Steve is going to talk about that. But the media campaign is going to start as early as January, just starting to get people revved up for the census, and it will have different phases that will coincide with the activities we're doing to reach out to people and get them to respond to the census. So Steve will tell you a little bit about how we're really going to have the best and strongest media campaign that we've ever had in census, and the most aggressive partnership campaign that we've had to get people to self-respond to the census. Now, I'm going to stop at this point on the mailing strategy to see are there any questions. Yes, ma'am.
So my question is, how do you determine if someone has if someone's logging in without the census account and just doing the address numerator, how do you account for duplications? Is that a human coded thing, or is it coming automatically? If someone doesn't put in the thing, has the same address but has different information versus whether they have the same information. That's
Okay, we have some deduplicating operations where we'll start to look for places where it's clear duplication, and where it is not, we'll be able to send someone out on the street to verify the information. Yes, ma'am.
What happens with communities like the Amish community or the Orthodox Jewish community? How do they get counted?
Okay, well, we have operations specifically designed to send enumerators who live in those communities into that community to visit those houses and personally take the information at the house. I'll talk about that a little bit later on when I talk about our update enumerate operation. But that's how we reach out to folks who are not using traditional mailing addresses, or communities such as the Amish community or some of our tribal areas that don't have addresses. I might also comment that places that don't have addresses get descriptions in our master address file, physical descriptions. Blue house, 1.5 miles from the intersection of road Y and Z. And I've seen those descriptions and worked them in address canvassing. Sometimes they get a little challenging, especially when they paint the houses in between the time that they wrote the description and the time that you're actually out there in the field trying to execute. But we try to get them to use non-changeable descriptions when they write a description of a piece of property in the description. I was on Catalina Island during the 2010 census and went out, and there was a description written by the address canvassers earlier that said, blue house facing the ocean. And it was in this particular area, there were 5 blue houses in a row facing the ocean. So it made it a little bit challenging. But we try to make sure that they're very descriptive where there are no addresses, so they're able to capture that information.
You're bringing it up later, I guess, but.
You, go ahead, you can ask first.
Working for you? I mean, yeah, or Orthodox, you actually have people within those communities, it's hard to believe that there would be Amish.
I personally cannot attest to that. However, we are recruiting actively in those communities for people and reaching to have community partners that have connections in those communities reach out and help assist us with the interface with those communities. Yes, sir.
Hi. Looking at the dates for your mailing of questionnaires, it seems to coincide with the tax season. Are there concerns around delays or, overloading the USPS?
The mailings or people's response? Okay, so we have Census Day has the registration, the reference date for census has always been April 1st. It has always coincided with April 15th, which is a tax season issue. We haven't had problems with that in the past. Deirdre?
Yellow. No, it's on.
Okay, the Geography Division serves as the champion to form our relationship with the United States Postal Service. And just last week, I was invited to attend a meeting between the USPS and the print vendor, the one who's printing all of the questionnaires, postcards, et cetera. And I was extremely impressed between the plans that they have between the print vendor and the USPS to ensure that all of the letters and postcards get out according to our schedule.
And these are not mailing dates. These are in-home dates. So we work with the post office to get an in-home date for when people should have that in-home, because mailing dates would scatter people's receipt all over the place. We are looking for that. Now, people may decide that they're working on their taxes up until April 15th and still we're still taking their responses after April 15th. Other questions? Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. There's another question.
On that last slide, it talks about April 8th and April 9th, mailing 4. And you said that's the date that you want those to arrive in the homes?
That is correct. Those are in-home dates.
But they're not, are they not allowed to fill this out until beginning April 1st?
No, people can, go ahead. Go ahead. They can respond to the census based on a reference date of where you will live on April 1st. Now, they can start responding to the census as soon as we open the site for our self-response in March 13th.
One of the things that we strive for is to get people to answer close to Census Day. And this is one of the struggles we have in our outreach and promotion campaign. As we start to ramp up and everybody starts to get interested in the census, they're anxious to respond, to get on record, right? And we don't want them responding in January. If they respond in January, a child might be born, somebody might have moved in. We want them to respond as close to Census Day as possible. So we don't open our internet site. We gauge our in-home deliveries so that they're coming in right around April 1. There's clear instruction that they should respond with the reference date of April 1. And then when we're in non-response follow-up, they have to remember back to April 1 who was living there then. And so the further we get from Census Day, the less reliable the data is. There are more errors when somebody's thinking back 3 months. But that's, I think, an answer to your question further.
Expecting the questionnaire to show up in home April 8th, that must be the assumption that a lot of people will fill them out in March.
That's right. And they'll be filling them out online from when we started. And that's why we set it up this way, is we want people to go online. But the point is that everybody in areas with low internet, I'm just restating what Al said three or four times, but it's worth hammering it, right? Anybody with low internet connectivity is going to get a form, and every non-responding household is going to get a form on April 8th if they haven't responded to the earlier mailings via the internet or telephone.
Yeah, we want to be very aggressive, letting people know that there are those three options to respond. But for those people that we can encourage to respond online, that's our first preference. Okay, for this next part of our discussion, I want to focus on the extraordinary lengths we go to as we make every effort to count everyone. We mail forms to 95% of the housing units in the country, but as you see, we'll have to do specific operations to get to the remaining 5%. The update leave operation, which represents 4.48%, is designed for areas where the majority of housing units do not have mail delivered to a physical location of the address. This is also used in areas that have experienced recent and significant changes to the housing stock. For example, as a result of a natural disaster, fires in California, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And now we're going to have to discuss whether this will apply to areas of Alabama, where we've had hurricanes as recently as yesterday and this week. But we'll be looking at those areas. Update leave is really an extension of the self-response, with the major difference being that a census employee, rather than the United States Postal Carrier, is delivering the 2020 census invitation along with a paper questionnaire. So while we hand deliver questionnaires, respondents still have the option to respond online or over the telephone by calling census questionnaire assistants, or optimizing their self-response by just going online. They will have a packet that enables them to do all of that, delivered by one of our staff who, when they're there, we consider this boots-on-the-ground operation. Similar to infield address canvassing, they can update our address list. They can identify missing or hidden housing units. And the operation involves knocking on every door. And when someone's available, asking if additional housing units exist. Leaving an invitation packet which offers the resident the opportunity to respond by internet, by phone, or by mail. And households that don't respond will be included in our non-response follow-up operation, which I'll talk about shortly. Now, update enumerate is an operation that accounts for about 1/100th of 1%, and it's designed to occur in areas where the initial visit requires direct enumeration rather than a follow-up visit. This will occur in geographically remote areas with low housing unit density, sparsely populated, that have challenges with accessibility. This operation includes remote Maine, Southeast Alaska, select American Indian areas that have requested to be enumerated in person during the initial visit. When we conducted our our earlier meetings last year and the year before with the tribal leaders, tribal consultations, we asked them, how would you prefer to have your tribe enumerated? And some of them wanted this type of enumeration. Others wanted to be enumerated just like the city right down the street. So they'll get in mail. They say we get mail. So we've worked very closely with the tribal governments to ensure that we are providing them with the option that works best for them. Now, this operation will occur throughout the same time frame, basically, that we're talking about update leave. However, we call it update enumerate. Our focus will be getting field staff who are familiar with the area, familiar to the residents, and with language or other necessary skills to facilitate a response. While self-response is possible, it's not expected to be the primary response method in these areas. Remote Alaska is a sub-operation of Update Enumerate and largely follows the listing and enumeration process of Update Enumerate. The majority of this operation will occur in remote geographic areas that have unique challenges associated with accessibility, which we find unique to Alaska. We'll work in partnership with village leaders to identify and hire enumerators who speak the local languages and who can translate and facilitate the collection of census response data. This is areas where the only way to reach population is when the tundra is still frozen and when we can travel to the villages where people live and when people have not relocated to hunting camps away from their villages. We start this operation off in late January, and it is traditionally the official kickoff of the census. The director of the Census Bureau will conduct the first enumeration in Tooksuk Bay, Alaska for the 2020 census. We also have operations that are specifically tailored to other living situations. The group quarters operation is designed for people who live or stay in group living arrangements that are owned or managed by an entity or organization that provides housing and services or services for the residents. Examples of these are college, university student housing, residential treatment centers, nursing and skilled nursing facilities, group homes, correctional facilities, workers' dormitories, domestic violence shelters. Group quarters generally have gatekeepers or administrators that can make residents in these facilities hard to interview. We conduct group quarters enumeration in all group quarters through either in-field visit or administrative records data. They generally do not respond to online enumeration. We have another operation which Burton mentioned earlier called service-based enumeration. That's for people who don't have conventional housing or they're experiencing homelessness. It allows them to be included in the census by enumerating them at places where they receive services or at pre-identified outdoor locations. Some examples of this include missions, hotels and motels used as shelters, places for children who are runaways, neglected, or experiencing homelessness, soup kitchens, regularly scheduled mobile food vans, emergency transition shelters, and targeted non-sheltered outdoor locations. Now what that means is under the viaduct, in the park, on the beach, places where you find a homeless encampment. We actually conduct this operation by working very closely with our partners and with advocacy organizations to build a list of the locations where people experiencing homelessness will congregate. We then visit these locations close to Census Day to conduct our enumeration. In 2010, I remember we did an overnight operation where we actually had people out in the homeless encampments overnight. The operation started late evening and ran through the next morning. And we were in the encampments. We visited the areas with facilitators from organizations that work with the homeless community, and they helped us ensure that we made our presence safe and effective to be able to count those people. A related operation called enumeration of transitory locations focuses on people who are highly mobile, don't have a usual home elsewhere. This includes campgrounds, RV parks, hotels and motels. We talked about that a little bit yesterday. I believe Burton talked about people who were in you were starting in Las Vegas area, in Nevada. Long-term living in hotels and motels. People who are in marinas, racetracks, circuses, carnivals. And finally, we developed special operations for the military, and those deployed overseas, as well as federal employees who are stationed overseas. Now, military installations are generally fenced, they're secured areas used for military purposes. An important feature of military installations is the enumeration includes both GQs, which are barracks, and individual homes, which are HUs. So there's on-post housing that are individual homes. We have military vessels, which are Navy or Coast Guard vessels that are assigned and have a home port in the United States. In order to support the military security requirements, military group quarters enumeration will occur by means of electronic data transfer from the Defense Manpower Data Center to the Census Bureau. We will receive administrative records for military personnel and their dependents from the Defense Manpower Command divisions who are under the Department of Defense. The federally affiliated count overseas is a count for people who are affiliated with the federal government but are stationed overseas, and we receive those counts from the federal agencies who have staff stationed overseas. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the military people or federal employees who are overseas. What about other
And their
people?
dependents.
Okay, what about other people overseas? If someone's working for, they just don't get counted.
That's right.
So is this the appropriate time to ask about how you count prisoners? Is this the appropriate time to?
You can.
Okay, so that's my question.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is if it's not a burning issue in the African American community, you know the issue. The issue is the prisoners are counted where they are incarcerated. The money flows to those communities, let's say Louisiana, goes to the parishes in Louisiana where there are not African American parishes, but that's where the resources go when the resources are allocated. So my question is, how does that get changed? I assume that's a political process, but what is the process, or where is the entry point to change that process, where the prisoners' money will go to the communities where they are from? Similarly, as with college students who are counted where they live and not where they go to school, if I'm correct?
They're counted at the school.
They are
College
counted at
students are
school.
at the
So
universities.
students are counted at the schools?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's where they are on Census Day. The only exception to that is like boarding schools.
Right.
Where they're counted in their homes and boarding schools. But in college and universities, they're counted at the location of the university.
But there is a population of students who are counted where they reside, at
If
their
they live
home,
at
at their home
home
address.
and go to school.
Right, because they're boarding schools.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, if you're boarding in a prison.
No, boarding students' schools as defined there are generally high school level.
Okay, but they're still counted. We're counting.
They're counted at home,
We're
yeah.
We're counting people. We're not counting citizens, right? Okay. So then the second part of that question is, and this is just a question: how do you count people who are detained, who are coming across the border? They are now in the United States. Are they counted in the census?
If they are in the detention facility, they're included in the count of that detention facility. That is correct. And I am not the person to really answer the question on how to change the process to get pressure to change the way we enumerate, but I'm going to refer that to John.
So I dealt with that issue quite a bit when I was director over the decade. And I would say at this point, the way that it would be changed would probably require an act of Congress. And the Congress was very vocal, especially the Democratic members of Congress, about this. Now is their opportunity that they could actually take some action if they wanted to. But I would think that would be the way that would be changed.
So it actually changes the census code? I mean, what does the act of Congress actually
The Congress could actually pass a law that says you're going to count prisoners where they were pre-incarceration. They could do that. But I would think that would probably be at this point, the only way that would happen.
USA Day, just to follow up on that. Can that happen this Congress? Will it be enough time to do it this Congress in time? So no.
Not for this
Congress is
census.
not
We're
gonna
pretty
happen.
much baked in terms of how we conduct those operations for this census. It could happen for 2030,
Okay. And
if it were to happen.
to follow up on that too, you mentioned the gatekeeper. Does the gatekeeper also provide the information about the people or just the numbers? Can prisoners also fill out their own form?
That is filled out by the administration. Prison administration fills out the information on prisoners.
States can also change their statutes in terms of redistricting requirements, right? So there's a federal issue, and then there's also a state
And we
level
will
issue.
provide tables to the states that would enable them, if they so choose, to realign things for in-state redistricting. In 2010, Maryland was the only state that asked for that, and
4 states passed
Oh, okay.
laws. Maryland, New York, Delaware, and California. I know Maryland and New York both implemented the change where they took their own records and moved state, not federal, but state prisoners back to where they were pre-incarceration for state purposes for redistricting. The problem is that doesn't change any of the federal numbers. So any federal grant or anything would depend on the official census count.
Just on the reaching out to difficult populations or transient populations, how does that dovetail with the effort to avoid double counting? So, for instance, if somebody is going from campground to campground, how do you know that that person wasn't previously counted at an earlier campground visit?
that is a challenge that we face when we are counting very mobile populations, such as people experiencing homelessness. But the attempt is to find out, where were you staying or living on April 1st? And if they correctly answer that question, they were staying at one of the places. Where we find them isn't where they were staying on April 1st, but the reference date is the date that we use to clue in to how to get them in one place.
This is a problem of double counting with people with 2 homes, particularly if they're in 2 different states, which state gets the number for apportionment. It's also a problem for children in dual custody families. Right? Again, that both parents may record the child as present. It's also an issue of, and this is an old one particularly, of parents who record their children in college because, their kiddo's bedroom is still upstairs, but on April 1st, 2020, he or she will be living in a dorm 100 or 200 or 1,000 miles away.
So this is going back to you mentioned that there was some tribal leaders that requested to be enumerated, so for them to have field visits. Are there other communities that have also requested that, or has the census implemented field visits for certain high-risk areas that have historically been undercounted?
You mean the update enumerate operation instead of update leave? One of the things I want to several people have asked about that, but when we got into discussion over what's the most effective way to enumerate those populations, most of them agreed that update leave is more effective than update enumerate, because update enumerate gets one visit, and they don't get followed up in non-response follow-up. Update leave gets a packet. They get an opportunity to respond on phone, on the internet, or by paper, and if they don't respond, they get followed up with non-response follow-up. because the design of update enumerate is designed for places it's hard to get people to and hard to repeat, they have that one visit. They don't get followed up in non-response follow-up. So it's a much better operation for them to participate in update leave than it is for them to participate in update enumerate. So most communities have opted to go that way if they had that choice.
I'm just curious, do you count U.S. territories like Guam, Marianas?
Yeah, we have a separate census
Okay.
operation in each of the U.S. territories. It's much more similar to the American Community Survey because it's the only time sometime to collect that wealth of data for them. But those are run as separate operations from the census in the state. Puerto Rico is managed as though it were a state, but the other U.S. territories have separate operations.
Yeah, right here. I just want to clarify on the 4 states that were mentioned earlier about how they count prisoners where they were pre-incarceration. But you said the federal data still doesn't, the federal grant money still doesn't. Yeah, sorry, I suppose you said the federal grant money still doesn't matter considering how they count it statewide. So I guess my question is at the when you look at the numbers on the census, the federal numbers, is that accounting for the state's own laws or is that accounting for the federal laws?
So the census puts out official numbers, and the numbers would include the prisoners counted at the prisons. And those numbers are used for all federal purposes. Now, states, and it's not just, some states, like I know Kansas, for example, also does some things to move entities around for their own purposes, for their own redistricting, drawing their state districts. And like I said, there were 4 states that passed laws that said we are going to move the prisoners to where they were pre-incarceration. That's for the state purposes. And they did not have any ability to move the federal prisoners in their states. Those were separate from that. So the Census Bureau also, I think, for this decade, as Al mentioned, is going to make available counts of group quarters. So the states could use those if they wanted to do something about the prison population. But the census numbers are the census numbers.
Okay. This might be for the cybersecurity section if it's not valid for now. But my question is for the internet itself, for you to respond to the census on the internet, do you have to be within the U.S. like let's say you're traveling overseas?
Yes, you do. You have to be within the U.S. The URL has to be a U.S.-generated URL that you're responding from.
Yeah, what I mean is like if you're traveling overseas, you won't be able to respond. You have to be inside the U.S.
Mail your paper form. Okay, thank you. Let's see, where did we leave off? Okay, we want to talk about non-English language support. Through the internet and over the telephone, we'll make it possible for people to respond in 12 non-English languages. They're listed right up in the first bullet. Spanish, Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, Russian, Arabic, Tagalog, Polish, French, Haitian Creole, Portuguese, and Japanese. Now, Chinese, we have simplified for internet self-response, which is a written form. And then at our census call centers, they are both fluent in both Mandarin and Cantonese. Those cover 87% of the households in the United States that do not speak English well. There's a threshold that says there need to be 60,000 or more households that are identified that trigger our inclusion in these languages. Additionally, we're going to provide support materials in 59 other languages, which takes the percentage to over 99% of languages. Now, for those people that fall outside of that, we're going to be working closely with partners who have partnerships in those areas where other languages and dialects are spoken to hire people who either as partnership assistants or as enumerators to be able to handle those languages in those areas. We'll also provide shells and templates of our materials to help individuals such as community leaders and language experts to support communities that speak other languages and dialects. Are there any questions on the language program?
Have any new languages been added this time around, or no?
What we did this time is we looked at the American Community Survey, we looked at that 60,000 household threshold, and we balanced the languages to match that. Now in 2010, we had 5 languages, and we're now talking about making this available in 12 plus English.
I think it's also worth stressing that in 2010, the only way you could get, you had to request a translated questionnaire to be mailed to you and then return it. In 2020, you'll be able to toggle, we'll have the languages across the top of the internet instrument, and you can click right on that language, go right into a translated form. We'll also have a dedicated telephone agent in every one of those languages, and our advertising, our promotional materials, our mailing materials will indicate that if you want to respond in Tagalog, there'll be a statement in that language, a phone number, you call that phone number, you're speaking to someone in Tagalog. It's a far more robust language program that goes far further into the population of households that don't speak English well than we've ever had before. We're very excited about it.
Another question.
So with the population of undocumented people throughout the country, what is the census doing to reassure them that the participation doesn't have broader repercussions?
Okay, that's going to be an active part of our communication and advertising campaign and our partnership campaign. We are stressing the census is safe and secure, and your information is safe and secure in the census, and that we're not sharing it with law enforcement or other governmental agencies. And so that will be part of the campaign. Stephen will talk about that a little bit when he talks about the communications campaign and the partnership.
So if I understand correctly, you said the threshold is 60,000 households.
Yes, that's correct.
In the South Asian community, there are different dialects people speak, and they are probably way more than 60,000 who are not being, taken care of in this. How are you going to deal with that? For example, Punjabis and Telugu and all of these people.
What we are doing in those cases is working to develop partners and partnership to ensure that we're hiring people who are fluent in that community, in those languages, to work with those communities with language. They can also take the templates that we're providing in the 59 other languages, which probably include most of the languages that you're talking about, and be able to use those templates to help people understand how to fill out their census.
So is there anything particular to the census that would prevent, like, say, an executive order demanding that you turn over information?
Yes, because it is the law. Right now, it is settled law that the census information is confidential under Title 13 of the U.S. Code that does not allow us to share that information. Any other questions? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
So on that elderly cohort, the 20% who are going to get original...
Not just elderly, but that's
or the
they're participants in that demographic,
right,
yes.
or the non-connected people.
Right.
Are all 12 of those languages going to be on that original questionnaire?
No, but they're able to respond to the telephone questionnaire assistance center, which is by phone, where they can do their...
So it will tell them in that language
Yes,
that they can respond with?
absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, I've tried, another question.
You guys recently put out the results of the CBAM survey.
Yes.
And just reading through it, it was really striking to see the comments from people and how concerned they were about the data in the census being used for nefarious purposes. And I'm curious if there was anything in there that surprised you guys, that concerned you guys, or whether it was consistent with what you've seen at this point leading up to previous censuses.
I think it was consistent with what we expected to see. not just at this point leading up to previous census, but just with the climate of the country in the last 10 years, we would have expected that. If we look internationally and in the U.S., we see that people's distrust of government is higher than it was 10 years ago. Their propensity to not want their information shared is higher than it was 10 years ago. Responses to surveys is down from where they were 10 years ago. So CBAMs kind of underscored some of those same themes, but the advantage of CBAMs was it enabled us to focus in on various segments that we can then focus in on how do we message appropriately to get those people a level of confidence to respond to the census. How do we design some of our media programs and our partnership activities to focus on those concerns that people have, to try to disabuse them of the worries that their information will be shared? So CBAMs provided a basis for our media campaign and our media program and our partnership design, but those were trends that we have seen building over the last number of years. There were no shockers in CBAMs. Okay. I've attempted to give you a sense of the enormous task that we have to fulfill our charge to enumerate the entire population. But before I go on, Burton mentioned one of our innovation areas concerns the use of administrative records. I think it's important to spend a little time talking about how we're doing that. Administrative records are data that people have already provided to the government. We use multiple sources. It includes files from the IRS, the Social Security Administration, Medicare, Medicaid, the Indian Health Service, and many others. Burton mentioned 14 different sources that we use to develop our administrative records database. We also use information from limited information from commercial sources to help drive that database. And data from both these sources help improve the quality of our address list, increase the effectiveness of our advertising and contact strategies, validate our respondent submissions, and reduce fieldwork for follow-up activities. The data will be used to model households as vacant, non-existent, or occupied. Now let's talk about that for a minute because there were earlier questions on that. This data helps us predict also the best time of day to visit some of those households. For housing units that are modeled as vacant or non-existent, enumerators will actually conduct one-person visit to determine the status and attempt to do the interview. If the attempt is unsuccessful and the house shows indications that it is occupied, that unit remains in our non-response follow-up workload. So we continue to handle that as though it were a non-responding household. If the attempt is not successful, if the house appears to be unoccupied or doesn't exist, and recent mailings that we've made to that address are returned by the U.S. Post Office as undeliverable as address, the administrative record status of vacant or non-existent will be used for that housing unit, and it will be pulled from the workforce. If census mailings are successfully delivered to that housing unit, it will remain in our workload regardless of the results of our first attempt. For occupied households in not hard to count areas, and I want to emphasize that this is only in not hard to count areas that do not respond and cannot be interviewed after multiple attempts, if there is existing high quality data from trusted sources showing stable historical housing, this data may be used to count and provide characteristics for the people in that household. Regardless of how our ADREC models the house, all housing units in the NERFO universe will receive at least one visit. This is a change for us from the way we were designing the program earlier in the decade. When we conducted the 18 tests, one of the things we found were that we had modeled some housing units as not occupied or vacant, and we sent people out to check and found a certain percentage of those households were actually occupied, even though we'd received postal information that said undeliverable as address and they had been modeled. That caused us to say, we will add one visit. At that point in time, we were planning not to visit those that were modeled and got undeliverable as address, but now we've added one visit to all those households to ensure that we have good quality on that data. So we've been researching how to use ADREC effectively for all this decade, and we think we have a formula for 2020. As we go to 2030, we may find more refined uses of ADREC to release some of the burden on our respondents and still collect a very effective census. This is my last slide, and it completes my walkthrough of what we think the operations we conduct during a census, and this is peak operations. It's non-response follow-up. Burton mentioned it's the most expensive component of the census. We deploy hundreds of thousands of people to conduct interviews with households that don't respond to the census. It is the largest non-military mobilization of the population that this country conducts. NRFU will start in early May 2020. After we've done everything we can to get people to self-respond, including mounting our most extensive, well-researched communication and partnership campaign, we then will still have people who would not respond to the census. We're estimating right now that 60.5% of people will self-respond. So that leaves us with 39.5% of people who still will not have responded to the census when we get to this stage in the program. I talked earlier about the things we've done to modernize our operations, but before we end, I want to talk a little bit about the steps we take to complete the enumeration. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, our enumerators will be equipped with an iPhone 8 that have special security protocols, an enumeration application, and an application that maintains their time and attendance records. In phase one, which we'll call full optimization, this phase is used to complete the easiest of the NRFU workload. The optimizer assigns cases to our enumerator's handheld device with routing information, updating the assignments every time they log into work. The enumerator, having received his or her assignment, will work the cases they receive, and I'm going to give you an example in the first day, just as an example. We use the reference attempt days, and that's what we call it. So an enumerator can make as many visits, attempts, as they feel they need to on that day, and that's still called one attempt day. So they may go early in the morning, they may go later in the afternoon, they may go in the evening. In the best attempt to find someone home, we consider that one attempt day. And this will come in important as I start to explain how we go from phase to phase. At the end of that work day, which is different than an attempt day, at the end of that full work day, all cases on the handheld are collected by the system and redistributed overnight in the most efficient manner based on the uncompleted workload that's left and the available workforce. People said, yeah, I can work Tuesday. I work Monday. So now those people who said they could work Tuesday get redistributed the work based on where the work is geographically and where they are geographically. This will continue for the first 4 attempt days of a case. The case will be reassigned each night and routed in the most efficient manner possible. What that means is I may have the case day 1, and Deirdre may have the case on day 2, attempt days. So it gives us 2 things. One is the opportunity to have different enumerators try the case, and different people try the case in an effective way to try to be most responsive to opportunities to collect the data. It gets us through the largest portion of our workload. We believe about 60% of the non-response follow-up workload will be handled in what we call optimization, full optimization, phase 1. We then move to the harder cases. We move to phase 2. That's semi-permanent assignment. Census field supervisor areas, those are areas that manage a certain number of enumerators that are managed by a particular census field supervisor, move into phase 2 once 60% of their cases have either reached the 4th attempt day or are resolved based on the results of the information they're able to collect in the field. Our 2018 test gave us an indication that this will occur somewhere between June 10th and June 17th as we start to roll to phase 2 of our NRFU operation. The harder cases during this phase are assigned to our best performing enumerators. they are in effect owning the case at that point in time. They get this case assigned to them, you own the case, you work the case. They're going to work the case multiple times in an attempt to get an interview or at least a proxy response from a neighbor or apartment manager or someone who can give us the information about the household. Finally, at the very end of the operation, where we're in a very small percent of cases left, we enter phase 3. This is our final push. In this scenario, cases are extended and the enumerators will make an unlimited number of attempts and close out the case when they get the minimum amount of data needed to support apportionment. And I just remind you of our primary goal of the census is to support the apportionment of the House of Representatives. So we really need to get appropriate apportionment data at the end. So when we're down to that last 1%, 2% of the cases, we're out to get the appropriate data we need for apportionment. And that brings me to the end of my section of our presentation. We're going to start to talk a little later about what happens to the data after we've collected them. But I hope you can appreciate the extraordinary lengths that we go to count people once, only once, and in the right place. Are there any questions?
So in the end-to-end survey that was done, I think in Rhode Island, there was a large proportion, don't quote me on the number, but at least a significant proportion of people who said that if the citizenship question is on the census form, they would be unlikely to respond. So my question is...
I'm sorry, where was that data gathered?
In the end-to-end survey.
We didn't ask that question in our end-to-end test, so we didn't have...
It was reported as such.
Okay, but that was not on any data that the Census Bureau collected.
Really?
That's correct.
Okay. So put that aside for a minute. The question is, what is the penalty for not responding, because it is illegal not to respond, as I understand it, and of the non-respondents, what percentage are actually penalized, fined, and how much money is collected?
I'm going to turn that question to Margot.
Margot?
Yes. Okay. She can give you a historical perspective on that.
I always start this question by pointing out that it's complicated. The requirement to respond to the census has been in every census statute since 1790, right? So Congress has mandated this. Having done that, we live in a kind of contradictory world where, as everybody is talking about here, you want voluntary response, right? So that's a deep contradiction, right? The Bureau and public officials have prosecuted cases where there's kind of willful non-response. The best one is a case that went to the Supreme Court by Eddie Rickenbacker after the 1960 census, where on principle he refused. He was a famous pilot to non-respond, and he lost the case. So the Bureau, this has been upheld and reinforced by Congress. It comes up in every revision of the census statute. Now, that said, the Bureau does not want to go around prosecuting people and almost never files fines or against non-response, even if they could take it to court and prove it. Right? Because given, you can hear what the defense would be. Well, they never showed up. I never got a form. You see? So this is one of the the kind of ambiguities of the process, that you're going to get a form that says you are required to, this is mandatory, Congress says you should do this, and yet we don't enforce it. I often ask my students about whether they've ever drunk underage, right? In other words, and have they been prosecuted for being in a bar at 18 or 19, or if they've ever had a false ID. So we live with a world of ambiguity on these matters, and the Bureau's, the census has, and its stakeholders have basically responded by basically trying to get people to answer and so forth. And I think the comment that Al made most recently about that the last effort is for the apportionment thing, that's a new thrust. I think that's a new way of thinking about it, and I think actually helps the, us understand what, how the Bureau is approaching this.
Yeah, let me just add a couple of things. One, on the mandatory nature and the fine, it's interesting that the founding fathers were serious about the census. So there was a $20 fine in 1790. That's way above $500 in today's dollars. They were absolutely dead serious. This was a key function of building this emerging nation. The second thing is just a slight tone. The Census Bureau doesn't enforce laws, right? The Census Bureau is overseen by a set of laws, and the Bureau itself would never prosecute. They don't have that's not part of their mission. That's another federal agency that would do that.
If I can say something, and this is the way I tend to approach this when I'm speaking to groups that have an interest in the census, and they ask that question. The census is not a program for the government or for the Census Bureau. The census is a program that benefits the people in the community. And therefore, it's not so much should you be penalized and charged for not helping yourself, but you need to recognize that you are penalized by not responding to the census, by not getting your fair share of the funds that flow into your community or the representation for your community if you don't participate. And that's really the biggest penalty that you have. I mean, if your community doesn't get the money, some other community does. If you don't get the representation, some other area gets the representation. That's a penalty. And that's, while it's not in the statute, you have hurt yourself in that process. That's the way I usually answer that question.
Sure. Yeah, you talked a little bit about administrative records modeling that you use. Mostly looks like government databases such as IRS, et cetera. But you kind of alluded to commercial services, so I wanted to know what those were, if you use any tech companies, Google, to aggregate this information.
Burton, are you going to answer? Yeah. Okay.
I'm not an expert on this. John, you might know, but there are a couple of private sources that we're using from real estate data to identify households and confirm households that are existing. I don't know more than that. We can get back to you with more information on that.
Okay.
Do you want to answer? Deirdre used to.
No, I can also mention that as we build our address list, we've assessed the use of commercial files. We purchased a spatial file to see if we could improve our roads, and we purchased 5 address files to see if we could improve our address list back in 2015. And again, I'm pleased to report that what that purchase did for us was validate that we have very good addresses in the master address file and Tiger database. Our list was as good as theirs.
Follow up.
What do you know who you purchased that information from?
I do, but I can't release that. We don't release that.
This is working. I wanted to get a better sense of what you mean when you say the last effort is for apportionment. Does that a different sort of data gathering or less information than normal? Is it not for funding? Like what does that mean? And then also I want to get a sense of, in the end, how many people, or do you have any sense of how many people or what percentage of the population just never gets counted? And are you concerned that sort of in this era of more divided populace, like are there people who are just off the grid, don't want to answer, don't want anything to do with the government,
So I'm going to talk about that this afternoon, the coverage error, the undercounts, overcounts, things like that, which will give you an idea of who gets missed and who gets overcounted.
Okay. You mentioned as a last resort asking neighbors, asking
Proxy.
managers
Proxy
and so forth.
respondents, right.
So
That's not new, by the way.
no, but is that what I've heard the phrase imputation? Is that what that is?
No, it
No.
isn't.
Okay. Can you explain that, and also why that's okay, but a survey is not?
So, a little background on that. So after the The 2000 census was very controversial. I might say a little bit about it, but there was a Supreme Court case that said you can't use sampling for apportionment. In the end, the last seat in 2000 came down to North Carolina and Utah. North Carolina edged Utah out by a few hundred people and got the last seat. Utah realized that if you took out census imputations, and I'll say what they are, then Utah would have gotten the last seat. Utah claimed in a lawsuit that imputation was sampling. It went to the Supreme Court. It was ultimately decided that imputation was not sampling, and as a result, the Supreme Court actually sort of defined what sampling was for their purposes, so it's interesting to read the case. So what imputation is, and you can think of it, what the census does, is when you have a non-response, the Census Bureau has to do something about that, because if you did nothing, you would be assuming that it's zero or the house is vacant. So the Census Bureau uses some statistical models to develop a process to create an answer for missing data. And sometimes they will take data from a neighboring housing unit. It's a fairly complicated process, but it's based on a statistical model to create an answer where none exists, or where there's non-response.
Hi. So I had a question about the number of visits, or the difference between the number of visits made for non-response cases versus the update enumerate that you mentioned. So earlier you made a point about how update leave is more effective for certain communities because update enumerate will get only one visit.
Yes.
How is that different from non-response follow-ups, which has multiple visits?
Well, the reason update enumerate gets one visit is because of the difficulty of getting to the housing units because of proximity and where they are. That's why that's in areas where you have very sparse housing, you have hard, difficult challenges to get to, while we talked about areas of Alaska and some of the large, like Navajo Nation, where the distance between units can be very far. That has one visit, but non-response follow-up has 4 visit days in the first phase. They could end up with almost an unlimited number of visits, depending on how far through the process that household goes. We are calculating that the average number of visits that will occur is approximately 6 during non-response follow-up, and to get the best quality data and to be able to get the data. It is designed as an operation to have multiple follow-ups, and update leave is designed that we drop the packet off, but if the person doesn't respond, they go into non-response follow-up, and then they follow the non-response follow-up rules. Because update leave is not designed around an area that we can't get to over and over. It's designed around an area that doesn't have good mail delivery. So does that clear up?
Yeah, I want to add just one other thing, that update enumerate has shrunk every census. It's now just less than 0.1% of the population, because these other methodologies are so much more rigorous in getting there. Even in the American Indian tribal lands, most of them are opting for either self-response or update leave, because it's a much better way to ensure we get to the household. And so it's gotten very, very small. Like Al said, it's only when you have just these enormous barriers to getting there, like remote Alaska, where you have to fly in when the tundra's frozen and stuff like that.